Hi, I am Saremy, and I'm going to be sewing the project bag with you by So Patterns, which is a product that I had from when I owned Chicken Boots. And it was a really great selling bag, and now I'm making it a home sewing pattern so anyone can make one. So let me show you how I used to make them. All right, so here's our materials. We have our document pocket with the outer bag, and I have these stacked up right now with the pattern pieces, with the lining, the outer, and the stiffener pieces all together because that's how they're going to go get sewn together. I really like separating the document pocket away from the pieces for the bottom because they're very similar. All right, so we have our document pocket, lining, outer pieces that are the front and the back, and the stiffener all together. Then we have our bottom pieces. Now, if you do get this piece confused with the document pocket, I'll tell you that the bottom is about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the other piece. So I have these stacked the way I'm about to tack them together. So I have my lining, my stiffener, and myself, my outer fabric. Then I have my end pieces. So I have the small pocket, the lining, the outer pieces, and the stiffener. Here is the vinyl divider, but you can substitute this for fabric. The sewing steps are exactly the same. And now we have our notions. We have the webbing. You need 2 pieces, 1 inch wide, 44 inches long. And then we have our elastic, 6-inch piece. You can use 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch, anything thereabouts. And then we also have our binding, and if you need any tips on cutting and sewing binding, I have a couple videos on YouTube that are really great and very short. So you need about 4 yards. It's 1 3/8 inches wide. All right, you guys ready to sew? Let's do it. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do, I've stacked my pieces over here like I showed you. I'm gonna set some things aside. I like to set them down in groups. Remember, I used to production sew these. So the first thing I'm going to do is separate the bottom out. And I'm going to layer it like a sandwich. So I have my lining piece, outer, the right side facing out or down in this case. And then I have the stiffener that I'm going to lay right on top of it, perfectly lined up, all edges. And then I have this outer piece, same thing, I'm going to line it all up. And I'm just going to tack these together on the ends. You can go all the way around if you want. Pinning is a little tricky when you're using stiffener. So just make sure this doesn't get off kilter back here. When you go to cut these out, the bottom pieces specifically, the grain line doesn't really matter, or the direction of the fabric, because you probably will never look at the bottom of the bag on the outside. All right, so we have this, we can set this aside. Now those pattern pieces are all tame. Now we're gonna bind our document pocket and our divider. We're not messing around here, we're getting right into that binding. Okay, so I like to start from the back of the fabric. And this is so that when I end my last stitches of binding, it's on the right side, the side that everybody sees, which is guaranteed to look nicer. So I start with it right side to wrong side, line up along this top edge, and I sew 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can back tack or not. I gently pull it. Trim it off, and then we're going to fold it to the right side, turn it under, and edge stitch it. Now the trick with binding, when you're really worried about hitting the stitch on only the binding, making sure that it stays on the binding front and back. It's not that important on the document pocket because you're only going to see the outside, but it's a great place to practice. The trick is that you can see where you first passed on the top here, so you just want to keep your needle to the right of this stitch line, and then you'll know that the needle's gonna land on the binding on the back side. So I just fold it just past that stitch line right there, but I stitch either right on the stitching or to the right of it. I like to use an awl as sort of a pointy finger. It helps me get really close to the needle, and I've never ever broken a needle on an awl. I think because it is rounded in nature, the needle kind of glides right off of it, but I don't even know if I've ever hit that at all, to be honest. All right, so now we're going to do our vinyl divider. So the vinyl divider has two short edges or straight edges, one long curved edge. So you're going to start on the back side, or it doesn't matter which side you do your divider, but you're going to bind this long curved edge. And I'm going to start at this weird little curve down here, 1/4 inch seam. And when you go around these curves, you're going to lift up your binding a little and kind of just walk it along here. I'm going to lift up my presser foot, kind of ease the tension. I'm gently pulling my binding. The trick also with sewing on vinyl or any kind of plastic is to keep fabric between your presser foot and the vinyl. The machine can drag on vinyl. It can get really hung up on it and not want to move. It just depends on the vinyl. Some vinyls are tackier than others. And I've found that the throat plate is less of an issue. It's the presser foot that gets hung up the most. So if you don't have the option for having a Teflon presser foot or similar, just keep fabric between the presser foot and the vinyl. And when that's not possible, you can put a layer of tissue paper in between. And then another trick I really like to use is I'll put Scotch tape on the underside of the presser foot, and then I'll kind of rub off all the excess that's sticking out from the presser foot with a nail file. All right, so now we have our binding on here, and you just want to make sure that this edge, the seam allowance here, is maintaining a 1/4 inch width. Around the curves is usually where I get a little bit sloppier. Now remember, this is a pocket on the inside of the bag. You're most likely not really going to see it very much. It's a really great opportunity to practice your binding. And with the added benefit of being able to see through the vinyl to the fabric on the back, it kind of gives you a peek of what's going on. So same thing, I'm going to pull this to the front, put the fold just past that first seam that I just sewed, and then keep my needle to the right of that seam. It just takes a little practice. And also, because I was pulling on my binding a little as I attached it, see, it naturally wants to turn to the other side and turn under. Makes it a little easier. If you like, you can use clover clips or something similar, binder clips, to hold your binding in place. Whatever you need. You don't really want to use pins on your vinyl unless you can keep it completely in the seam allowance, but the vinyl is a little tricky to pin through. All right, getting down to these weird curves. Now this is at the very bottom on the inside of the bag. Nobody's going to see this, so don't sweat it. Get around this curve best you can. All right, go off the edge, and now just trim it, make it flush. And you're going to set this aside with your document pocket and your bottom. Okay, so next we're going to sew our small pocket. And I have two methods that I'm going to show you today. So if you have a serger, you can just overlock the top edge of your small pocket, and then you can turn it over at that 3/4 inch hemline. Oops. And stitch down in the serging the hem. Whatever width your elastic is, just make sure that you're leaving room for it. I have a loop turner. This isn't the way we would sew in production, and I can show you how we do that as well. So you're gonna put your elastic on the loop turner or a safety pin. I'm kind of far away. There we go. Oops. So when I get that elastic up to the edge, I like to sew through all the layers. And then same thing here. I'm going to pull it out further like this and kind of loosen it so I don't lose it in there. And now we have one small pocket. We only need one for the bag, but I'm going to show you 2 ways to sew it. So if you don't have a serger, the other way you can do it is you can iron your hem, the 3/4 of an inch mark, and then turn under 1/4 of an inch as well, and sew a casing. Now when we used to do this in production, we would do this all in one step. We would attach the elastic to either end of the pocket, and then we would fold it over the elastic and stitch down the casing, just avoiding the elastic inside. We didn't use either of these methods, but these methods are actually really nice. Well, ours would always look like this when we were done. I would just sew it a little differently. Here we go. So now we have this fully clean finished version of the small pocket as well. So you can choose either way. All right, so next we're going to do the top edges of all of our pieces. So we're going to pull out the ends and the front back, the lining and the outer pieces, and set aside the stiffener. So you can tell that the lining is a little bit shorter than the outer pieces here, and that's to create the hem that rolls to the inside of the bag. So if you had cut these pieces out and they have a one-way design, just make sure now that you're paying attention to the one-way print so that you don't get any upside down elephants or anything. All right, so I like to set mine up side by side. This is the top edge of the end. Actually, I'm going to set that over there. And then you're going to sew these together, 1/4 inch seam along the top edge. You're going to do this for all 4 of these pieces, and then just set them aside. And the same thing with the outer. In production, we would have all of this staged so that we were doing all different fabrics all at the same time. And then we would just go through the stack, and they would just stay lined up. All right, so we have our top edge of the front or back. Quarter inch seam, and same with this one. You may have also picked out a motif to be on one side of your bag. So just start remembering to pay attention to that, just in case you only have a motif on one side of your bag and then the document pocket's on the other side of the bag and it has the motif. So you want to make sure you put the document pocket on the side of the bag that didn't have the motif so that you're not covering it up. I've done that before. All right, so now we're going to iron the seam allowance here. So I like to position them when I'm doing a few. Kind of stack them up. You're going to press the seam towards the lining. Just like this. We would do, 20 of these at a time. Just press it towards the lining. All right, now we're going to take our stiffener and we're going to wrap these pieces around the stiffener. So we'll start with our ends. I always like to put the outer fabric down, lay the stiffener on top like this, line it up, and then I wrap it. That way I can make sure that this seam allowance here is pressed towards the lining and doesn't get twisted. Especially if you're cheating and not ironing it, it helps. All right, then you can just set these aside. You want it pretty snug, but you don't need to pull. All right, so now we have our front and back. So line up the stiffener to the bottom edge right there. Line up the lining. Make sure you don't twist that seam allowance right here. I tend to be a puller when I sew, so I'm really trying to be gentle. Occasionally I'm releasing the pressure of my presser foot so that it's not pushing the fabric. I find when there's a lot of layers, the linings can get, or the interlinings can get kind of shifted around. All right, so then we have this last one here. Make sure there's no thread or lint in here, especially if you have this white stiffener and you have a light colored lining, it will show. Every little piece of lint shows through. It's kind of a pet peeve. Or you'll feel it. The stiffener is so smooth that you can just feel and see every little thing on top of it. All right, so now we have our front and our back and our ends. And now we're going to attach one of our pockets to the end. I'm going to pick this little pocket. I have a choice here because I'm looking at my birds. So you're just going to tack this pocket on here and make sure you get these top edges straight across the pocket from each other. So make sure also that you get this full seam allowance lined up with this edge right here. When you only have 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's really easy to kind of lose some of it by not lining edges up. And you don't have any to spare. It also makes the pocket lay a lot nicer if you can get that whole edge lined up with the raw edge of the side. All right, and so pivot. We used to always attach our label right here. And I'm gonna go all the way up. You could tack this edge if you like as well. It does help when you go to sew the final steps of your bag, which is kind of the big money shot, right? All right, so next we're gonna put in our straps. All right, so we got our straps. We're just using a nylon or a polypropylene webbing here. You can use cotton. So you have your notches. Where are my notches? I can see them here. Now you aren't going to sew the webbing into the seam here because it gets a little too thick because we still have to attach the bottom to this, the vinyl, the vinyl divider, the document pocket, and we've got to bind it. So let's just keep the webbing out of the seam for now. And we're going to put it about 1 inch above our notches. Turn it under about 1/2 inch back stitch. And now you're just making a big box, big rectangle, and I'm going to pivot at the top and go across the strap. About 1 inch away from the top. We used to always use a different color bobbin thread for this step. So that's totally possible if you like. All right, and so now you're gonna do your other strap. So it's one strap per side. Make sure you don't twist your strap. That's the worst. You cannot fix this once you are completed with the bag. All right, again, fold it up. Just line it straight up with those notches right there. Now if you get one of these a little crooked, you can cover that side up with the document pocket. But don't tell anyone I told you. Go all the way around. Don't take anything to chance. And plus you want this webbing to be nice and flat. All right, so let's get rid of any of our threads now, while it's easy. So I think the most important thing when you're trying to position your straps is that the straps are across from each other across the bag in the same location, right? But if you're following the notches, you shouldn't have any problem with that. The other thing to consider is that you want to be consistent with how much you turn under the strap and where you place it away from this edge so that the strap lengths are the same as well. This is kind of a hard one to pin to the bag because you're kind of in the middle of the bag and it's pretty thick. So what I like to use is this side edge here. I'm looking at that to keep it nice and parallel. You could even draw a chalk line or pin a line. My assistant always used an old label that I used to use. It was the exact width that we wanted from here. So she would put the label right here and just kind of make sure she had it the same on both sides. A ruler works good too. All right, so pivot at the top. My binding's kind of getting hung up on there. All right, so now we have our front and our back. We have our ends with the small pocket right here. We have our divider, we have our document pocket, and we have our bottom. So now we're gonna start with our divider. Man, I used to make this divider so complicated. I used to think that it needed to be fully flush with the entire interior of the bag. And what I learned is that even though there's this little bit of a gap and this just barely touches the bottom of the bag, it's fine. We're not putting really tiny things in these sections of the bag. We have a pocket here and we have the small pocket for the small items. And you could make them a little notions pouch to go in their bag, right? So you don't really have to worry about people putting small items in the bag. You can tell I didn't stitch that very straight. I'm a little out of practice. But you know what? It's inside the bag. If I had used matching thread, probably wouldn't be that noticeable. All right, so this is one of those cases where the vinyl may come in contact with the presser foot. So if you want to avoid that, you're going to line up these straight raw edges of the divider to the corner of the bag. That's the bottom of the bag. This is the top of the bag. You'll often see me sewing the bag and it looks upside down. You could just tack it right here on the binding edge, right there, and right here. My machine will sew this. Pretty sure this vinyl's okay. The other thing you can do is you can tack it from this side. All right, so we just need a few tacks in place to kind of keep it from shifting around. And now we're going to sew one side of the divider that gets attached to the bag. So right now, this is going to be the main pocket. We're going to sew straight lines straight up parallel to this strap. If the strap's not straight, then go parallel to the raw edge of the bag. And you're just going to go to the top of your bound edge and back stitch. So just go right here at this little crook, anywhere in here, and go straight up. If you have to make your presser foot only in contact with the fabric and being in contact with the vinyl is a problem, you can do it from this side of the bag as well. Just look for that little spot right there. and go straight up parallel to your webbing, and you'll feel when you get to the bump of the binding and then back stitch. It's on the inside of your bag, don't worry about it. I'm going to do it from this side so you can see it. I don't need to back stitch there. There we go. So now we have 1/2 of our divider complete. Now we're going to attach the document pocket. I always put it on the side with the divider. It doesn't matter what side you do. It was just a good practice for us to always be consistent so we wouldn't forget one. All right, so you're gonna line up your divider with the raw edges of your bag. You're gonna keep, your document pocket, and you're gonna keep your divider out of the way. So keep this little flappy guy just kind of in the middle of the bag. And you're gonna attach your document pocket to the front of the bag. Doesn't have to be the front, I just call it that, to be clear. You can stitch around the entire perimeter if you like. This looks like it could have used a good press, so maybe I will. So I'm going to start now on this side. I'm just lining up these raw edges. Again, occasionally I lift up my presser foot to release some of the tension. I do really like a lot of pressure on my presser foot, and you adjust that with this little screw here on my machine and on a lot of other machines as well. All right, making sure I'm not catching my divider. And my document pocket is looking a little long for this edge right here, so I'm gonna fix this real quick. I've been a little loose on my lining up. So we'll just let that hang off now. In my opinion, the layer that kind of rules all layers is the stiffener layer. You don't want the stiffener, I'm just gonna trim this little bit of excess off that I just created. You don't want the stiffener to be loose inside the binding, and so the stiffener is really kind of the bones of the bag. And so if your lining doesn't meet up to the stiffener, you're going to have to trim it down to the lining. You just need to be really careful about how much you're trimming. But if you're cutting everything accurately and sewing with the 1/4" seam allowance, you shouldn't have any problem at all. I don't see any stitching right here. Here we go. All right. Yeah, I think my bobbin wasn't picking up right there. All right, so here we go. Now we have our front of our bag, we have our document pocket, we have our divider, we have our interior pocket. Now we're gonna finish sewing the divider. So I finally figured out a really easy way to do this. So line up your bags with the tops lined up right here. Okay, line up your tops. And now look inside here, and you're gonna see that this stitching for the divider, about where it's gonna be. So you can just slide over your bag. Really the most important thing here is keeping the top of your bag lined up. I know that you're gonna probably worry that your divider isn't sewn straight across the middle of the bag. But when you look down on the bag and the divider, if the divider's a little bit askew, that isn't as big of a deal as if the bag was uneven at the top, because then your bag will sit wonky. It won't sit kind of flush. It'll actually pull to the left or the right. So most important thing to think about is leveling up your bag at the top here. And then just stitch this divider down parallel to your strap. And don't worry that this isn't a sharp corner right here. Just stitch it down. It really won't matter. The only reason it's rounded is so we could run it through a binding machine. All right, so there we go. And so now you have your bag with the divider in there. Just like that. And so see, if I hadn't sewn it level across here, it would be sitting kind of weird like this. It would be sitting like that, and the bag wouldn't sit flush. It's less important if the divider's straight across from the other side than it is if it's nice and level. All right, so now we're getting close to doing the last bits. So now we're going to attach our bottom. It's a little awkward, but you're just going to push this aside like this. You're going to push your front or your back, whichever one this is to you. Just push it aside and you're going to focus on this seam. Make sure all of these layers are lined up with this raw edge. Same here, because you only have 1/4 inch. So I have my binding here. Line up these edges. Right sides together. I start on the bottom of the bag, but remember the lining sides are together, belly to belly. I start on the bottom of the bag and roll the binding to the front or the back of the bag, the outer bag, so that the last bit of stitching that's showing is on that side of the bag that I can see. I never look at the bottom of the bag. It's just not something that you do. And so you don't have to worry about it looking as nice as the front or the back. All right, so line these up and just make sure you're keeping the other side of your bag out of the way. Here you definitely want to back stitch because we will start pulling on this seam when we attach the whole bag together. All right, so keep all of your edges lined up. 1/4 inch seam. Trim your binding. And then look at your edge here and make sure that it's consistently 1/4 inch wide. Making it nice and consistent in width, it makes it a lot easier to bind and makes it look a lot nicer. Get rid of some of these extra thicknesses here. That's where the binding was to the divider. All right, so now we're on the front side of our bag. We're gonna pull the binding to the front or the back, whichever one you're on, and you're gonna bind it. But first I want you to take a look at the inside and make sure that seam you just sewed, I know your bag's in the way right there, make sure that there's nothing poking out of it, because now's the time to fix it. Trust me when I tell you, I've skipped that step before by accident, and it wasn't a good time to skip it. All right, so I'm going to fold my binding just past that stitch that I just stitched. And then I'm gonna stitch to the right of the seam. Now you're getting into some heavy duty sewing. You may wanna switch your needle to a 16 if you haven't done that by now. Or look for a denim needle, use one of those. I have sewn this on the home machine and it works fine. You may need to stitch some of these spots with your hand wheel, one stitch at a time when it gets really stiff. All right, so we have one edge of binding and now we're gonna do the other one. Now our bag's gonna start looking like a bag. All right, so now I'm gonna tell you a little secret. If you've ever ordered one of these bags, you're gonna be kind of shocked at how I treated it before you got it. But you can do some serious bag smashing now. So you're going to, again, you want the bottom facing up and you're going to line up this edge and you're really gonna let it know who's boss. It's gonna resist you. You're gonna line these edges up. I like to just get it going and then I kind of let it know who's boss. So I use the machine as kind of a third hand. So now I'm always stopping needle down, especially when we get into these heavy duty sewing areas. You really want to make sure you stop needle down. A lot of machines have a setting where you can set it up to automatically do that. Or if you just tap your reverse button once, your needle will sink down. I think also some machines, if you press on the presser foot with your heel, it'll do it. So just look in your book, you may have that feature and I highly recommend it. Otherwise, just use your hand wheel, turn it toward you and sink the needle down in there. All right, so now this is getting all kind of wonky. See, it wants to kind of be all higgledy-piggledy there, but we're gonna tell it no. It's gonna be really happy in its new life as a rectangle. So we're going to smash it down over here. You're really gonna have to manage that. This is just the beginning. Keep this nice and lined up. Once you get going, it starts behaving. This was my upper body workout for 10 years. All right, trim off your binding. Make sure your seam here is a nice consistent 1/4 inch. Roll your binding to the front or back of the bag and edge stitch. Even if you don't get this quite right, it's at the bottom of the bag. It's really not that noticeable. You're going to be surprised at what you don't notice after a while. So be nice to yourself. This is some pretty heavy duty sewing. And this wasn't the machine that I used, but I used one really similar. And my other machine liked doing the heavy duty sewing a little more than this one did. All right, so you can tell, like when I was tacking these together, I'm definitely a puller, and my lining is sticking out a little bit, so I'll need to trim that up. So now we are to the final step, the part that probably is definitely the most daunting, but I'm here to help you through it, all right? And I definitely had to teach myself all these things. And, you know, I used to always think, oh, that person taught themselves how to do it. I'd much rather trust someone who's a teacher. The thing is, I feel like when you really want to learn something and you figure it out, you almost learn it in a really thorough way, and you start learning to think about it logically because no one is telling you, they're not spoon feeding all that information to you. I'm not knocking instructors because I know how valuable they are, but I'm going to tell you, I learned a lot just from trial and error in doing binding and figuring out where things are in relation to each other when they're sewing. And there's a lot of times where I'm sitting there trying to check out where my needle is on the bag and where it is on the other side, and it really helped me understand where the binding is and how to make it work for me. All right, so now look at this. Our bag is almost done. So we have our ends. You can start with either one. We always put the one with the end pocket on the bigger compartment. Just no reason, we just did it so that we were very consistent. All right, so here we go. Now, remember, we're gonna do some really serious bag smashing. And I promise, if you've bought one of these bags, you saw that it came to you and it was totally fine, it survives. You're not going to hurt it. I mean, if you're doing something like a waxed canvas and you've omitted the stiffener, you're gonna get probably some character wrinkles in your waxed canvas. If you're using a linen, you might get some wrinkles as well. You can always steam it. We had a lot of luck ironing the little bits like that. The vinyl can take a certain amount of warmth, and the stiffener can take a lot. So, all right, so you're gonna line up. I like to sew on the side of the end first, and I line it up belly to belly again, and I line it up at the top of this side here. So my bag is sitting here. This is, for me, this is what I call the back of the bag, and this is the side with the document pocket. Doesn't matter how you do it. So I'm just going to use the verbiage that is in front of me for now, just to be consistent. So the bag that's touching the table is the one I'm sewing onto first. So we're going to put this belly to belly. Make sure all your edges here are lined up. Now here's another sneaky little thing. If you didn't tack this edge right here first, you have the danger of the lining crumpling in on itself when you start rotating the end piece as you're sewing it. So just be aware of that. And I'll show you little techniques I'm doing. I'm always putting my hand in here and swiping out to make sure, because I did have a run of bags once that did that because I had changed my sewing process and it had negatively affected a different aspect. So I had to get used to it again. All right, so take your binding. You're gonna line it up here line it up with the raw edge right here, and then you're gonna extend it about 1 inch above the bag, and now wrap it to the back. This just saves us a step and it makes it nice and clean finished. And now you're going to start, and you're definitely going to back tack. All right, so here we are. Now, I know I don't use pins, I don't use clips. You can try it, but it's a pretty tricky thing to use the clips. You're just going to have to rearrange your clips as you go. All right, so line up your edges. And I kind of gently tug my binding. If you can remember to do that, it'll be easier on your last step. 1/4 inch seam. I'm always making sure my lining is totally smooth and there's nothing sneaking back into the bag. Now when you get down here, you're going to line up 1/4 of an inch above this raw edge right here is the seam line. So that's the spot that gets lined up with the seam of the bag right here where we already bound this bottom. So remember, seam line to seam line. So the raw edge is going to extend past this seam right here. So now another thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put my hand in here and I'm going to smash this bag open much further right here and get that lined up. So right here, that little spot lines up on the 1/4 inch seam line. So if you need to draw the seam line on there to make it easier, go for it. But that is what makes it successful. So make sure you keep this open down here. And then I'm stopping 1/4 of an inch above this raw edge right there. Make sure I'm in there. And now I stop with my needle down. I'm gonna pick my presser foot up and I'm gonna pick this end up and I'm gonna slide it over to the end here. Just like that. It should line right up. And now I've pivoted my binding and I'm gonna keep going. Now this is pretty thick sewing right there. You've got a lot going on in those corners, so be really careful if you're on a home machine. All right, so now you can tell our bag's trying to line up right here. It's really smashed. Looks like it's in a little bit of a pretzel. We're gonna open this up a little bit and we're gonna press this seam that way towards the bottom of the bag. And we're gonna mash it again. All right, I'm really mashing it. Keep all these edges lined up at the bottom. Let's line that up a little better, just like that. You can really rely on it. If the pressure of your presser foot is strong enough and your needle is down, it's really gonna help you. All right, so same thing. When we get to this little juncture right here, we're going to pivot 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge so that it's like right in there. I'll lower the camera for the second one. All right, so we're getting to that corner. I can feel down there that I'm feeling that crease right there. That's where I want to stick my needle. Now I'm going to pivot again, just like this. And hopefully your bags line up at the top right here. Now if they don't, here's a couple of strategies. Let me get my bag going a little bit here. So now look, my lining was trying to crumple inside there, so smooth out your lining. If you need to hand wheel crank a few stitches, go for it. Get a little bit further so you can see the whole side of my bag. So if this last leg doesn't line up perfectly when you get to the top here, a little bit isn't going to show that much. It will if you really look at it, but it really doesn't scream at you. And so if you're like within 1/4 of an inch, just let it go for your first time. All right. Now, if this one is too long, this whole piece, you're going to have to remove your stitching to about right here. And you're going to slide this whole piece that way, the amount it's off. And it's going to hang off this back edge there. Not the bag, just the end piece. Now, if this one is too long, you need to raise this one up. So take out your stitching to here, and you're going to pull the bag a little bit shy of this edge here. Pivot a little bit higher. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're getting close to the top. I'm a little bit off. I'm gonna trim my binding about 1 inch longer, a little more. I'm gonna wrap it around, lift my presser foot up so I can tuck it in there, and back stitch. So now there's our little tail on each side. My bag's pretty smashed. And we need to trim our edge now. So we're going to trim this down to a nice 1/4 inch. And when you get to these corners, don't lop them off like you do when you're sewing the corner of a collar or other corners. You do want your edge to be filled in there still. Now also don't make the mistake of cutting your binding. Now it kind of hangs out right there and it is really easy to nick the binding. That was usually, if we had a second, that's usually what it was. So I'm just trimming a little bit there. You can do a little under the 1/4 inch width on these corners because the binding does have to stretch a little bit to get around that thickness. All right, so I'm just trimming this away. You really want that 1/4 of an inch to be even all the way around. So let's look at our corners here. This one right here, I'm just going to trim this a little bit. Just rounded it a little bit. So there we go. All right, so now look inside your bag and make sure nothing is sticking out of that seam. So make sure you really investigate it. Now's the time. If you have a little piece of lining, you know, right about here, fold it in, just pop out the little stitches right there. Look inside here and see where the lining is folding in there, and then fix it and then stitch it back up. You don't need to take out the whole seam. All right, so now we're going to put our other end on. I don't do the last step till the very end. It's kind of like a treat. This is the hard part. All right, so same thing. Belly to belly, line up the top edge right here. And you can see I'm kind of lining up all my raw edges to the shortest possible layer. Anytime you're trimming your bag, you just got to make sure you don't overly trim anything, because it will affect how this fits in here. Because remember, if you were to measure on the seam line, these 3 sides, it needs to measure what this does on those 3 sides. But the weird thing is, because of the thicknesses, it does act a little bit differently. It's why your pattern pieces are all different sizes for the lining and the outer and the stiffener. Even if they were the exact same height, because these aren't, because they wrap with the hem to the inside. Even if they were all the exact same height, they would all be a little different from one another because of the thickness of the stiffener. All right, so we're lining up all the raw edges together. Make sure all these little threads are pushed toward your seam allowance. And now we're getting down to this corner here. And so I like to push it open a little more like that. Really stretch it. Make sure this edge is extended past that pivot point. And one thing to note as well, I noticed this with my industrial machine. You have to remember, the feed dogs are pulling and the presser foot is gliding forward towards you, right? It's not actually moving. It seems like it is, but it's not, just the fabric. But at the same time, it's pressing that, it's got all that pressure pressing down. So in a way, it's pressing this layer toward me, whereas the feed dogs are pulling away. Sometimes all your layers can get a little off when that's happening. All right, so now my needle is down. I'm pivoting. I tacked around all these edges down here, so I'm not worried at all about the lining misbehaving. All right, so now I'm getting to this side, and I'm going to press this bottom seam towards the bottom, like this. I kind of open up the bag, press it. I'm kind of exaggerating it, and then I press the bag away, just like this. Try and get it so you can see as well. I was going to lower the camera for you guys. Here we go. So here we are. We have this raw edge right here extending 1/4 of an inch past this seam right here. And we're going to sink our needle right here, right on the seam line. 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Use my neat wheel to get that one last stitch, and now we're going to pivot one more time, making sure all my layers are nice and smooth. This is the vinyl, so it's definitely behaving. I rotate my binding over here, line it up with the raw edges. Don't forget to put your presser foot down when you start sewing. I know you're thinking about a lot of things right now. You're getting your upper body workout, your hands are doing a million things. It's an accomplishment, I know. All right, so we're getting to the top. We're almost done. So we're going to trim off an inch past, wrap it. I'm about 2 inches away from the edge when I start fiddling with this. I've got it down pat, and I kind of know that usually I can line it up with this edge. All right, so we have our 2 bags two ends sewn together. We've made our bag now into a bag. We're going to trim this edge. Because we cut this binding on the bias, it does have a little bit of stretch, so it is going to be able to stretch over this thickness. You just need to make sure you don't make it too hard for it to do. All right, so let's put my hand in there and kind of fluff this up. Get the other edges away from the scissors. Kind of get the big chunks off first, and then I look at it and do the refining trim. Okay. All right, so let's look at this edge here. Make sure I didn't catch anything. Let's trim this a little bit here. All right, it's looking pretty good. Sometimes you have a little bit of a width, a bigger width right here at the edge where the pocket hem is. It's a little thicker. You can just trim it just under the seam allowance if you like, just to give it more width for the binding. All right, so now my favorite part. All right, so let's look at our bag, make sure our ends are sewn in there, the seams down there are nice and clean. Nothing's poking in there. And now take all your little corners and flip them out. I love doing this part right here. Flip it out right there. And now we're gonna sew the last two steps. Same step 2 times. Okay, so now you're gonna take your corners here and fold them to the front. Now if they're feeling particularly shallow, you might want to trim that seam allowance a little bit more. This is going to be okay as long as I have enough to turn under and I can sew it down so that it's not going to be a raw edge that sneaks out. We're going to be good. Up here is kind of the easy part. So now I'm going to do what I call an envelope style folding here. Okay, so I take my corner and I turn it down. Just like that. It's the only thing different I do. And then I'm going to turn under this edge, long edge here, twice, just like I've been doing for all the other binding. So the reason I do this is if you're just like, I've had it, lady, I just want to get going and I don't want to figure out some weird folding technique, totally fine, go for it. The reason I do this is if you just fold this twice, my problem is that this little tail likes to sneak out. And it just doesn't look that great over time, you know? And then little threads start coming off of it and you know? So I just turn down this corner here and then I do the rest exactly how you normally do. Turn it a quarter, turn it a quarter. I fold it. It's gonna be a little bit tighter this time, but if you have an awl or something similar, you can pull it over. Even if it's a little shy, even if it's folding only to there, you can pull this over because it's stretchy. Because of the bias. It's not like quilt binding that's cut on the cross grain quite often. You see that my machine gets hung up on this edge, so be careful. My straps will sometimes also grab the corner of my table, so be really careful. You don't want your bag yanking anything and pulling your hand towards the needle. All right, so here we are. I'm using my awl. I really rely on the awl. It's just such a great tool for me. Once I figured out, I don't know what made me try it. I don't know where I got the idea, but I haven't looked back. All right, it's a little messy right here, so we're just gonna cover all that up. All right, so now I'm getting close to the corner. I probably should have turned this under an inch ago. All right, so we're gonna turn under our corner. I'm sorry, the black is probably a little hard to see. Look how smashed my bag is though. Look at that. It's just like a little flat thing right now. All right, so I've got my corner. I kind of like to hold that corner in there and then I pick up my binding and pull it over. Just like this. Nice and steady. If you have good thread and you have a good needle in, you should be fine. Now make sure you stop with your needle down. And now you're going to arrange it. I'm right before that big thick juncture, so I might bonk the camera a little bit, but here I like to put my hand inside the bag and I'm spreading apart the front and the back so that I can kind of smash down this center part like this, just like this. Put my presser foot up. and just pull over. If you need to hand wheel it, we'll hold it and then we'll hand wheel it. Make sure you put your presser foot down. You can just stitch by stitch, just like this, and you'll get through there. And once you're past that thickness, you can start sewing again. All right, so we're getting close to the corner. Turn under that edge. Now's the time when it's a little easier. Just turn it under. It'll stay like that because of the pressure. All right, now I'm picking it up, pulling it over to the seam, mashing my bag. I spread out the seam and then I mash it down so it stays. All right, home stretch on this one. If you're getting skipped stitches, you're gonna want a new needle or a bigger needle or better quality thread. All right, so we're at that top now where the little envelope corner majiggy is. And so I flatten this out. And I have learned that doing this tight makes it not as neat. Weirdly, I always wanted to pull it really tight and it makes it kind of pointy. So now I've learned just relaxed folding works best. And this little fold right here coming just shy of that raw edge works best. You got to sometimes just let the fabric do what it wants to do. And it's a lot easier to make it do what you want it to do if you let it do what it wants to do as well. All right, so I just fold that little corner or back stitch that corner down. And here we go. We have one full end done. I got off of my binding right there a little bit. If I wanted to fix that, I could go back. That was that little spot I said was a little messy, so I was trying to cover it up. All right, so now here we are. One more time. You got this. All right, we're gonna fold our corner down, fold it in, fold it over. And like I said, I just get it going. I move this out of the way. Move that other corner out of the way. Otherwise it might get caught under your needle. So I get it going and then I arrange my bag. All right, so this little edge here of the turn down binding, I tuck that in there and I pull the binding over it. Okay, I'm getting down to the corners. I pull them over, just like this. So I'm pulling my corners. I pull the corner over I pull the bias over the corner, just like this. I kind of push the bag like this and I turn under the edge. And it's ready to go when I get there. All right, now I push this a little bit out of the way as well. Just trying to lessen the thickness when I get to the corner. Use your hand wheel if you like, just like this. And then you're gonna pivot. So take the bag, kind of put your hand in there, and I'm like opening up this bottom seam and the seam right here, opening that up, just flattening it out as much as I can. The divider kind of wants to do its own thing. It's still turned under. Oh, we're hand wheeling it. Yep, hand crank, hand crank. Got past your thickness. Now you can carry on with the sewing. All right, so now we're approaching this other corner. Take the binding. I really pull it, and then I turn under the edge. 1/4 inch, just like this. Use my awl to pull the binding over as well. And I just want to cover up the first pass of stitching with that fold. And you'll find one corner is a little thicker than the other because it has the vinyl in it and the document pocket. Okay, so same thing. That was your last corner. Home stretch. These take a lot of practice. right, so we're at our last corner to fold down. And make sure this little messy edge gets in there. Voila. All right, let me trim my thread. I don't get to admire it until I've trimmed my threads. Kind of beat it out and look at that. You can't even tell I was doing that serious bag smashing. It's always a little slack down here because before you've used your bag, you can see the stiffener kind of does this little curvy thing. That's partly because my stiffener's on a roll, and I think the overall use, the overtime use of your bag is going to break it in. But once you have something in there, it all lays nice and flat. So now you're ready to put a project in your project bag. Good job. I'm really proud of you. I know how hard that is. I really do, firsthand. And it's not easy. It takes lots of practice. I've sewn hundreds of these. I know I make it look easy, but I know that it isn't. I really, really do. And I've had bad days too. So if you ever want to sew with me live, I'm on YouTube as Sew Live, and I'd love to have you. We have a really great group of people that like to sew, and we sew all kinds of things there. So I hope you'll join us sometime. And I really want to see what you made. So please tag it if you're on Instagram with SS Project Bag or Sew Patterns, and I will definitely tell you what a genius you are. So thank you so much. Have a great time sewing your project bag. Hope to see you again. Bye.